Okay. Now you know. Okay. Hi everyone. Let's make a start. It is my great pleasure that we have Adrit Sarkar here today from Microsoft Research in Cambridge, UK. I'm not going to say very much about Adrit, but I've known Adrit for a long time. Mainly through his work also in kind of interactive machine learning and end user programming of spreadsheets. But it's really great that we have him here today to talk to us about Copilot, which is, I think, on everyone's mind for a long time. So I won't say anything more. I'll just hand it over to Adrit.
Thanks, Simone. Yeah, there's not a lot to say really, and I can go into some of the stuff that I've worked on previously later, but I think we should just crack on and start talking about what I think the risk generative AI poses to knowledge work. And what we might be able to do about it. And I should say I'm here as a representative of a much bigger team. There's a long list of collaborators here, some of whom have contributed slides to this deck and contributed the research that I'm drawing upon to present this to you. So it's not like a top-down organization or anything. There's no hierarchy. We're kind of like a team that's working together on this. And I am just one humble representative of what we're trying to do here. So let me paint you a little picture of what I thought AI was doing to knowledge work at one point in time. So in late 2022, I was writing this paper about what AI is doing to creativity. And I was looking at studies of AI-assisted knowledge work, from programming to visual art to science fiction writing, and trying to see, okay, well, what's happening to creativity? And I made some observation about creativity, but what I also noticed is that the kind of stuff that people say they spend their time on is also changing. So they basically, I mean, this might seem very obvious in hindsight, but basically they say they spend less time producing stuff, less time physically making letters appear on your screen or pixels appear on your screen or whatever, using their input devices. So this manual process of material production, because their AI tools were doing it for them. And they were spending more time on what's called critical integration, which basically is like deciding whether and how to use AI and then assessing the output. So it's kind of, you get this kind of sandwich where on either side of the material production, you've got a human applying some critical thinking to say, what do I want? And what's wrong with what the AI has produced? How do I shift it into something that's closer to what I wanted? So I thought this was a nice picture at the time. But then, of course, as 2023 and 2024 progressed, we've got not just a small set of isolated groups of people who are using AI to do their knowledge work, but now basically we see the drive to integrate large language models and automation into all aspects of knowledge work, whether it's producing slides or writing documents or email summarization. So you have now on the Apple operating system sort of system-wide integration of ChatGPT and every text box. Microsoft has Copilot in all of its Office suite and on Windows. Google has Gemini integrated into its entire Docs suite. So there's a strong push that we'll kind of widen the scope and capability of the things that we want to automate due to what we think we can do with generative AI, right? So when large swathes of the population are using generative AI for large swathes of their work, that's a very different situation to when small specific groups of people using AI in very specific intentional ways, right? Here we have now a general tendency or the opportunity for general tendencies for technology to shape knowledge work emerging. And so one such tendency is this thing, is this idea of mechanized convergence. It's a very simple idea, and it draws from ideas of mechanical reproduction going back to Walter Benjamin, and before that probably Marx, that the demands of factory logic are such that when you automate the production of something, the things that you produce all look the same to each other. And what are some examples of that and so we start seeing examples of that in knowledge work. So for example, study of participants writing short stories with AI assistants found that, exposure to even a single idea from generative AI causes people to produce stories that are much more similar to the average story, right? Or this study, this fairly, now at this point well-known study, this jagged technological frontier study of BCG consultants, compared those who used ChatGPT and those who didn't. And they found that people who used ChatGPT produced all basically the same set of ideas. Similarly, Anderson found that when people are doing creative ideation tasks, people produce less semantically distinct ideas when using ChatGPT, and they also feel less responsible for their work. And they're calling this a homogenization effect. Similarly, a study of conversational search built on Gen AI found you have more selective exposure compared to conventional search. And the author's calling this generative echo chamber. And this study from last year as well, a very large study of co-writing, found that people tend to shift their opinions to match the kind of opinions that the language model is throwing at them. So all of this is kind of building towards a picture that there is a general tendency not for people to critically think about AI output, but rather to uncritically kind of accept, to a certain extent, the things that language models are producing, and generative models more generally are producing when they are used as part of everyday knowledge work, right? And so we are kind of interested in why this might be happening, because people don't obviously willingly want to give up their autonomy over their work. Like these BCG consultants are presumably very smart people. And so this kind of suggests, want to try, A, figure out why this is happening, and B, whether it happens in data analysis and end user programming, which is the area of research that I spend most of my time in, like trying to help people do better data analysis with Excel. So we thought we could maybe do this as an interview study or a survey study or something like that. But for various reasons, these existing methods kind of all fell slightly short in terms of answering the research question that we had. So we developed a research method called participatory prompting. And the core of participatory prompting is basically this loop where the participant sort of interacts with an AI assistant or some sort of end user tool, mediated by a researcher who helps them with their prompt formulation. And then after each turn, we have a set of guided reflections that ask participants to think about, their experience of writing this prompt and their evaluating the AI output, right? And so in this study where people completed analysis tasks with Bing Chat, so we kind of found a few reasons why people struggle with critical integration. There's obviously the very sort of now at this point well-trodden result that there's barriers to intent formulation and query formulation. It's hard. Johnny can't prompt, et cetera, et cetera. But then we also found that in the verification aspect or the evaluation aspect, there's just a fundamental set of things that kind of combine together to make it very, very challenging and different from a normal knowledge workflow. So there's a large volume of output. First and foremost, you can, it is so easy to produce output that the space of the output that you can potentially have to explore is really enormous and intimidating. And then there's different kinds of verification activities. So you might just be trying to check the output to see whether the language model has understood what you wanted it to do, understood in scare quotes here, of course. maybe if it has understood what you want it to do, you need to figure out whether it's made any factual errors or hallucinations. So that's checking for correctness. But then a third level is checking for quality. Well, okay, is it beyond the basic facts, beyond basic correctness? Is this something that I can use as is? And what kinds of modifications would I need to do? So, but all of these things are kind of bundled up in the user's mind. They're kind of doing all of them at the same time. There's no structure to this evaluation process. And often when people are just the edge of their expertise, so people might not be experts in statistical analysis or machine learning or something to do with their data analysis task, but because of the conversational and web-based nature, surface that Bing Chat offers, the conversation ends up inevitably, as you would perhaps when you speak with an experienced colleague, brings up concepts that you don't know about, right? This might be the first time the user has ever heard of R, but Bing Chat brings it up. Like maybe you could use R to do something, or the first time the user has heard of correlation analysis, and Bing Chat brings it up. So then there are these demands of these metacognitive demands of do I try to learn what this is in order to pass this? Do I kind of trust the AI to know what it's doing, and I can just say, okay, I don't need to think about correlation analysis, but I know Bing Chat seems to know about it, so I can trust Bing Chat to do it. Or do they sort of abandon it because it's like, oh, we've gone too far into an area where I don't know how to proceed, and let's just scrap this and start all over. So all of this basically leads to a strong tendency for people to accept the thing that is at face value, because when you're faced with a very high cognitive load, a complex decision to be made, the sort of most straightforward thing to do would be to fall back on very simple heuristics for, okay, does this look roughly okay? I can probably trust this. Let's satisfice. Okay, so this is the problem so far, that basically we really like people to be doing this, to be sort of critically thinking when they're working. But instead, what we get is this. Everybody basically just, all of their work looks the same because ChatGPT produces the same set of ideas for everybody. And thus it leads to sort of a lack of diversity of thought, of personalized response in different knowledge work situations. And because this is a tendency, it's not a fixed rule. It's important to think about this sort of in the aggregate effect, right? The aggregate effect of having a little bit of convergence to a norm whenever somebody is reading or drafting an email with Copilot and Outlook, or drafting some text, or writing a formula. Like, what is the aggregate effect of billions of people every day being nudged slightly a bit more towards a sort of standardized response that comes out of whatever data and heuristics the model is biased towards producing, right? So the solution that we have been exploring, this is not the only solution. One solution would be to ban large language models entirely, obviously. But the one we've been exploring is to try and get people in the loop of interacting with these systems to think more critically. And we build on quite a lot, at least 75 years of research on critical thinking in education. Because it turns out people in education research have been thinking about this for a long time. How do we teach critical thinking? How do we get students to think more critically? How do we build this as a skill that they can then take with them into the rest of their lives? I mentioned Bloom's taxonomy. This is heavily debated. What critical thinking even is heavily debated. Bloom's taxonomy is a kind of fairly stable pillar where Bloom and colleagues have categorized 6 sort of types or levels of thinking skills, going from knowledge, which is just the recall of facts, all the way up to evaluation, which is applying some criteria to judge the quality of an idea. And the top 3 levels, analysis, synthesis, evaluation, are often described as sort of higher order thinking, which is often thought of as synonymous with critical thinking. it's very, very contested. But this serves as a good rule of thumb for what I mean by critical thinking. And then this has been operationalized in quite a lot of really nice research. And I pick on Gabriel Solomon because he very charmingly calls his work AI in reverse, even in the 80s, which I think is quite prescient. And I couldn't actually figure out exactly why this terminology is used, but it seems very relevant. Basically, Solomon's intervention was, when students are reading a text, can we improve their comprehension by getting them to think more metacognitively and critically about their reading process? So it's a very simple intervention. All it does is it's a reading interface that while somebody is reading something, a set text or piece of a text from your textbook or something like that, from time to time you receive a question to stop and reflect. So a question is like, what do I understand from the text so far? What thoughts occur to me on the basis of this passage of the title? And what he found is that even such a simple intervention can result in really quite significant improvements in comprehension. Now, of course, students are not the same as knowledge workers, and we don't know if people are motivated, knowledge workers are motivated in the same way to pay attention to prompts like this and reflect. But we thought this was a really good starting point because there's a large evidence base that these sorts of critical reflection prompts do help, and they help consistently in a set of domains. So we developed this sort of framework or vision, rather, of AI as critic, and opposed it to the dominant kind of narrative of AI as assistant. And we don't think this is a replacement of AI as assistant. We think it's very important still, but what we're trying to do is add to this and show a different dimension of what AI can be in knowledge work, right? So rather than just getting the job done, we want to help users figure out what it is that they're trying to do in the first place. Rather than getting the job done quickly and efficiently, we want to help them get the job done better. And the big research challenge, I think, for that faces AI as assistants is things like errors and hallucinations, factual inaccuracies, as opposed to critical thinking, which is really a problem, I think, in the user's head rather than in the system. So we kind of want to help build this skill, and every interaction with a large language model, with an AI assistant in a knowledge work context is kind of an opportunity to exercise critical thinking. It's not always equally important, obviously. In some cases, sometimes an email is just an email, doesn't really matter. You get Copilot to draft it, send it off. It's okay. It's okay if it's whatever, boilerplate text. But in some cases, it's really important. And I think one of the things that we really would like to explore is helping users get a sense of when that is important, because the tool looks identical, right? Copilot in Word or ChatGPT is not super context sensitive. It doesn't know how critical you need to be when you're drafting, say, some casual document versus, a reference letter or something that carries a lot of weight or importance. So what could this maybe look like? So here's just some mock-ups. So Copilot in Word has a very common feature, summarize a document, commonly used feature. But of course, we know that all summaries are not equal, they're not alike. So even a summary that is completely factually accurate, in the sense that it doesn't misrepresent anything in the text, could still omit some things, and it could still overemphasize some things, and could still have a tone that doesn't match the rest of your document or whatever. So maybe instead of just saying AI generated content may be incorrect, we could have provocations that say things like, there's some potentially missing content here. Maybe the risk section is not adequately included, or maybe there's some detail in the findings and some positivity that you might want to bring in. Similarly, in PowerPoint, maybe you've generated a chart, and the chart is easy to understand, but it doesn't show trends between quarters, and trend lines could provide this. So the user could choose to react to this, to add the trend lines, or ask Copilot to do it for them. But I want to emphasize something here already, which is that AI as a critic is not for automatically fixable errors. So if there's some obvious shortcoming in the output, we should just generate the better version of the output in the first place. We shouldn't try to use the human as a kind of band-aid to make up for the fact that the technology is crap. What we want to do is pose questions to the user where genuinely there is not enough context available, and maybe the user might not even be aware that this is something that they need to pay attention to. Where there's not enough context available for the model to decide what is a good solution in this case, right? So, so that's a kind of that's why we kind of want to present these as considerations, right? Does not show trend between quarters. Well, okay, it's only the user who can decide whether showing trends between quarters is important in this case. That information is not available to the model, and maybe the user hasn't thought about it until this point, right? So, reflecting on this and then deciding that I'm not going to include trend lines is still a critical thinking outcome. So not having actioned anything about it, but having moved the user a little bit forward in their thinking about why they've presented this data in a certain way is a positive critical thinking outcome from our perspective. Okay. So then we were like, okay, let's try this out in practice and see what happens. And this is a there's a lot going on this slide. I'm very sorry. Don't worry too much about the interface. So but I want to give you sort of a high-level overview of what we built and what we were trying to test. So we built a prototype for the activity of shortlisting. So selecting a small set of items from a larger set, which could be selecting a set of films to watch in your family movie night out of a big set. It could be having a big set of charities and choosing a small set to donate to, whatever, choosing a list of candidates to interview out of a long list of job candidates. Very common activity, and it's a kind of data analysis activity. And so GenAI can help you with this because it can suggest, okay, this is the data you have. Have you considered, based on these columns of your data, looking at looking at these factors to help you make a decision, right? So that's a pretty standard kind of assistance mode. And what this is showing is basically the user uploads their data set and starts saying just something about their interests. So maybe I'm interested in movies based on historical events. And then we generate two kinds of things, factors and critiques, so or provocations. The factors are the sort of AI as assistant mode. So for instance, genre, movies with biography, history, war in the genre column. So what this is basically saying here is in order to prioritize movies based on historical events, you could consider looking at the genre column and filtering for these strings, okay? But then we also generate a critique. So this is where AI is a critic. So we take this suggestion and try and offer a risk or a limitation or a bias of it. So in this case, I know it's really small, but it says, not all movies in these genres are based on historical events. Some may be fictional stories set in historical periods. An alternative could be to look at the tags or summary columns for more context. Okay, so that's an example of a critique. Sometimes these critiques can be useful. Sometimes these critiques are not useful. We kind of wanted to figure out, does having this actually help people think more critically about their work? Does it just overwhelm them with more information and more stuff to read? If it helps, why does it help? If it doesn't help, why does it not? How can we improve on this experience? Okay. So we did a study within subject experiment. 12 people did tasks with provocations, 12 without provocations, where they went through one of these shortlisting tasks end to end, and inspecting the factors, inspecting the provocations, making edits, and thinking aloud. So the high level, I won't bore you with too much details, methodological details, but the sort of high level insight is that this does genuinely have a effect on critical thinking. And in some cases, participants are literally aware of it. Perhaps the user interface is also suggestive, so that's a limitation of this interpretation. But at a high level, people say it makes us think, and that's kind of what we were going for. It makes you think a different way. P4s realized that they were biased, and I thought I'm biased, but only in a good way. But now I read this, I'm thinking maybe it's not good to be biased. And then P5 says, I really find it fascinating that it can stumble into making you consider things you didn't consider before. And the second sort of high-level finding that I want to share is that through engaging with these critiques, people felt greater sense of agency and autonomy over their work. And P10 put it really nicely, because P10 comes from the medical world, and they have this concept of patient-centered care, and they found this very analogous to patient-centered care. Right? You have to present all the options to the patient. You have to let them know from the best to the worst, what does each pathway lead to, and then leave it up to them to decide. Okay, so that's the research, the sort of end of the published research so far, and what are we working on currently? So now we're thinking about taking it back from this sort of abstract domain of critical shortlisting, and how do we put it into a knowledge work product that people actually use. So we're thinking about provocations in Excel Copilot. So maybe users ask for an average, and then Copilot does it, but then asks the user to consider a risk of using an average, or a limitation, or an alternative. So here are some examples. One thing I want to compare and contrast between this example and the critical shortlisting example is that prioritize movies based on historical events is pretty open-ended, and the kinds of factors that you can generate are also pretty open-ended, so they're kind of by default amenable to critique. But when you just ask for an average, like, that's a very specific request that large language models at this point have very low likelihood of producing an error. It's like, give me the formula that computes an average of these numbers, 99.99% of the time, six sigma, whatever. Even the worst large language model is going to be able to produce a correct answer to that. But even in these very simple situations, there's an opportunity to kind of provoke critical thinking about the intent behind making this average. And that's kind of what we're going for. Is an average appropriate? If you've got outliers or this limitation, should you really be comparing this quarter with the next quarter as opposed to the same quarter year on year, right? Because often when people come to these tools, they don't come to it with an expectation that it's going to help them with an open-ended decision. A lot of the time, people have already worked through, in their own way, a process of what do they want to do, and computing the average is one step on the way, and they know that Excel would understand that, so they type into Excel, give me an average. So can we use that as a way to broaden out? We kind of also want to make these highly contextual, because we found in the user study that the more contextualized the critiques were, the more likely people were to find them actually useful. So in this case, we have a limitation for somebody who's asked to sum a column of the temperature data. And we've tried to, in our prompt engineering and heuristics, try to bias the model towards producing contextualized critiques based on the headers and the kind of data distributions inside the data. So here you get, total temperature doesn't account for seasonal trends or geographic variations which are inherent in temperature data. Okay, that's just a proof of concept. It's maybe not the best example of contextualization or adaptation, but this is what we're trying to get towards. Okay, so I am just going to close with a set of mock-ups that continue to show what we are currently working on and exploring. And this is just meant to be kind of general discussion fodder. So this is going to be pretty rapid fire, and then I'll wrap up. Because I promised I'll only take half an hour so that we can have lots of very agitated discussion about this. Right, so this is what you've seen so far, this kind of tabbed structure with four kinds of insights, risks, limitations, biases. So we're also thinking of introducing and teaching the user about existing critical thinking frameworks. So in this case, Edward de Bono has this framework called 6 Thinking Hats, where there's 6 different roles people can play in a conversation to bring a sort of diversity of perspectives and have more productive conversations. So maybe responses to the user's utterance are framed using these six approaches. So for example, the hat around new ideas looks at some alternatives to averaging and returns some actions as well as text. So we have some interesting thoughts about or findings from the study about whether or not these provocations should be actionable, whether or not every suggestion that the AI produces should also just have a button that says, do this for me, please, which we can talk about later. But this is just an example of how that would work. The blue hat acts to summarize the framework's outcomes. So we could include low-level critiques that's talking about the specific thing about averaging that the users asked for in this case, or also high-level thinking that includes broader issues like including stakeholders in whatever it is that you're trying to average. In this mock-up, this shows the idea that we're not using critique always to just push back on what the user is doing, but instead, sometimes we might want to give them a broader sense of why what they're doing is useful, and perhaps on other benefits of what they're doing that they perhaps didn't realize, to make them aware of it. So here are a number of ways in which averaging might give the user different kinds of insight into their work beyond whatever they were already thinking about. Yeah, so drilling down into one particular approach, comparative analysis, we can see again here the system is referring to the user's actual content and suggesting 4 different criteria through which they can do different forms of comparison. And so finally, kind of most wildly of all, certainly from a Microsoft perspective, is well, we can think of critical thinking as just complementing the side pane experience of Copilot. We could also think of it as a completely immersive experience that somebody might use to analyze and think about their work. So the actual data might take a backseat in this case. And so here we're using Bloom's taxonomy. This is super rough. This is just like, slapping the Bloom's taxonomy on top of Excel. But the point here is, what if we have a framework for critical thinking in a sort of full screen space that kind of can take over your knowledge workflow from time to time as you need it to, because sometimes what you need to do is step away from the actual thing that you're producing and start thinking more in a sort of deeper fashion. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. I'll leave you with these three takeaways. The first is that generative AI is shifting knowledge work from material production to critical integration, ideally. However, the tendency for mechanized convergence is showing a deterioration of critical thinking. And finally, we think that using these in-context provocations based in the theory of critical thinking from largely education can help. Okay, and that's me.
So we have lots of time for questions. I'm just going to stop the recording.